Have you ever seen a revolution start in a YouTube comment section? It begins with a noble cause, like arguing whether a pineapple belongs on pizza. At first, it's about freedom, taste, and basic human decency. But a few hours later, people are doxing each other, forming ideological death squads, and promising to salt the earth where their enemies' houses once stood. How does that happen? How do we go from, I disagree with you, to, I must utterly destroy you and everything you stand for? Well, a very handsome, very French, and very chain-smoking philosopher named Albert Camus asked the same question, just with slightly higher stakes. In 1951, he looked around at the 20th century, a century that was basically a non-stop international t-shirt cannon contest, except the t-shirts were bombs and the prize was genocide. And he wrote a book called The Rebel. He wanted to know why so many movements that started with posters of heroic workers and promises of paradise ended with secret police, mass graves, and leaders who looked suspiciously like the tyrants they just overthrew. So, let's dive into Camus's world of rebellion, revolution, and why being an edgelord can be a very dangerous thing. At the heart of it all is the rebel. The rebel is the person who finally has enough. They're the first person to stand up in a board meeting and say, actually, this synergistic paradigm shift is complete nonsense, and we all know it. The rebel draws a line in the sand and says, no. No to oppression. No to injustice. No to being treated like a disposable cog in a machine. But here's the cool part. Camus points out, every no contains a yes. When the rebel says, no, you can't degrade me, they're also saying, yes, there is a shared human dignity that is worth protecting. They're not just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for everyone. They're willing to die for the idea that some things are just not okay. So far, so good. Our rebel is a hero. But then we get to the paradox, the big stinking uh-oh at the heart of rebellion. Stalin? He was a young rebel fighting the Tsar, Hitler. He sold himself as Germany's rebel savior. They all started by saying no to an old power, and then became a new power that was infinitely worse. They were the ultimate example of, you either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. So, what gives? To understand this, Camus takes us on a little field trip through history, starting with a crime scene, the death of God. The German philosopher Nietzsche famously declared, God is dead, in 1882. But Camus argues he just signed the death certificate. The murder had been planned for centuries by a gang of thinkers Camus calls the metaphysical rebels. See, back in the day with the ancient Greeks, if a tidal wave wrecked your village, you just shrugged and said, Poseidon's in a mood again. The gods were basically superpowered, dysfunctional celebrities. But then Christianity came along with this idea of one all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God. And suddenly, evil became a huge scandal. If God is the perfect landlord, why is the building on fire? The plumbing is backed up with scorpions, and my neighbor is a serial killer? This question drove the metaphysical rebels nuts. First up, you had the Marquis de Sade, history's horniest philosopher. He looked at all the suffering and basically said, well, if God allows all this messed up stuff, then I guess everything is permitted. And then proceeded to write novels that would make a demon blush. His idea of liberation looked a lot like a few masters getting to do whatever they wanted to, a lot of victims, a creepy preview of the concentration camps to come. Then you had the Romantics, the original Goths. They made rebellion into an aesthetic. They wore black, wrote tortured poetry about their beautiful, beautiful pain, and glorified outcasts. They turned rebellion from a moral act into a fashion statement, a way to feel special by standing against society, even though they needed that society to feel special against. Finally, Nietzsche shows up and tries to clean up the mess. He says, "Okay, God's gone. Total chaos. But this is our chance. We can become superhumans, the Übermensch, and create our own values." A noble idea, but his concept of a will to power was like a really sharp knife left lying around. Nietzsche probably meant for us to use it for spiritual wood carving, but the Nazis picked it up, and well, you know. All these thinkers started with a legitimate complaint. The world is full of unjust suffering. But they tore down the Cathedral of God without agreeing on what to build in its place. And that philosophical rubble would become the foundation for some of history's most monstrous projects. This is where ideas stop being polite and start getting real. First stop, the French Revolution. They took all those Enlightenment ideas about freedom and reason and decided to put them into practice. They chopped off the king's head, which was more than just a haircut. It was beheading the entire divine order. Humans were in charge now. Their new operating system was virtue. Everyone had to put the public good first. A guy named Saint-Just became the lead programmer. He argued that since the new law was the voice of perfect, rational virtue, the law could do no wrong. And if you disagreed with the law, well, then you were an enemy of virtue itself. And the only way to deal with an enemy of virtue is, you guessed it, the guillotine. It was state-sponsored terrorism in the name of a perfect society. Then Russia decided to play the same game, but on nightmare mode. You had millions of peasants living in near slavery under the Tsar. Meanwhile, young intellectuals in Moscow were reading German philosophy and getting really into the idea that history has a destination, and a little violence is just the jet fuel to get us there faster. The first Russian revolutionaries at least felt kind of bad about killing people. They were like, this is awful, but it's a necessary evil. The next generation dropped the awful part and just went with necessary. Then Stalin came along and dropped the necessary part and just went with evil. This is how you get the twin nightmares of the 20th century, fascism and communism. They were supposed to be opposites, but they ended up at the same bloody address. Fascism basically said, Nietzsche was right. Everything is meaningless. So might makes right. History is written by the winners, so let's just start winning. It's a philosophy with no breaks and no destination, just a thirst for more power, which meant it always needed new enemies to fight. Soviet communism, on the other hand, was what Camus calls rational terror. It had a supposedly scientific blueprint for utopia, courtesy of Karl Marx. The problem was, Russia didn't fit the blueprint. So Lenin said, don't worry, we'll make it fit. A small group of professional revolutionaries, the party, would seize power and drag the ignorant masses into paradise, whether they liked it or not. The state that was supposed to wither away became the most powerful, all-consuming state in history. Both movements started as a rebellion against injustice. But they both fell in love with an abstract idea, the master race for the fascists, the historical destiny of the proletariat for the communists. And they were willing to sacrifice millions of actual, living, breathing, smelly, complicated human beings for their perfect, clean, inhuman ideal. So are we doomed? Is every rebellion destined to curdle into tyranny? Camus says no. And he finds the answer in a weird place, the artist's studio. Think about it. The artist is the perfect rebel. They look at the chaotic, messy, often ugly world, and they don't just accept it, but they also don't try to burn it all down and replace it with a mathematical formula. They take reality with all its flaws, and they create something from it that has form, beauty, and meaning. A great novelist doesn't reject reality. They give it a coherent shape. They create a world where actions have consequences and where individual lives matter. They strike a perfect balance between the real and the ideal. This, Camus says, is the model for true rebellion. A true rebel, like a true artist, never loses sight of human reality. They fight injustice, but they respect the limits of being human. They reject oppression, but they also reject the godlike ambition to create a perfect utopia tomorrow by creating a living hell today. The real rebel builds, creates, and affirms life, even while they say no to the forces that seek to degrade it. The lesson from the rebel isn't to stop fighting. It's to know how to fight. Rebellion that serves an abstract ideology will always end in slavery. But rebellion that serves living people in all their messy glory is the only thing that keeps us free. It's about choosing humanity over perfection. And speaking of choosing freedom, one small rebellion you can commit right now is against the tyranny of the YouTube algorithm. That cold calculating machine wants to tell you what to think and what to watch next. Don't let it. Seize your own means of intellectual production, hit that subscribe button, and ring the notification bell. It's a small no to the machine and a big yes to staying human, probably.